Here's William Lane Craig to give some goofy arguments for the existence of the soul.
Dr. Craig, across theism, you see this commitment to the idea of the soul. Whether it's Islam, whether it's Christianity, whether it's Hinduism, whatever it is, there's this commitment to the soul. But my question really lies is, why should we believe that we have a immaterial soul that exists past our material death? Seemingly, neurology shows us that anything that we could attribute to being the soul, the consciousness, our perception, awareness, whatever it is, can all be materially posited in the brain.
Not only is it the case that anything that is typically attributed to the soul can be performed by the brain, anything that is attributed to the soul can only be coherently conceived as something carried out by the brain. If the soul is not a material entity, what would it mean for it to do anything? What would it mean for a soul to carry out the activities of thinking, feeling, perceiving, and any of the other activities that it supposedly does? What would it mean for a non-physical entity to even exist? What is it if it isn't physical?
There are Christian materialists, like Peter Van Inwagen at the University of Notre Dame, but I think they're wrong.
The idea that there is an immaterial soul which exists distinct from the body is also not likely what the folks who wrote the Old Testament believed.
I think one of the hardest things for people to get their mind around is that ancient Israelites, and then Jews, and then Jesus himself and his followers had a very different understanding of what the relationship between what we call body and soul. Our view is that you've got two things going on in the human person. You have your body, a physical being, and you have your soul, this invisible part of you that lives on after death. That you can separate the two, and they can exist. The soul can exist outside of the body. That is not a view that was held by ancient Israelites and then Jews, and it's not a view taught in the Old Testament. In the Old Testament, what we would call the soul is really more like what we would call the breath. When God creates Adam, he creates him out of earth, and then he breathes life into him. The life is in the breath. When the breath leaves the body no longer lives, but the breath doesn't exist. We agree with this. I mean, when you die and you stop breathing, your breath doesn't go anywhere. And that was the ancient understanding, the ancient Hebrew understanding of the soul, is that it didn't go anywhere because it was simply the thing that made the body alive.
The Old Testament view of the soul is not that it exists as some non-material substance that is or can be independent of the body. The Old Testament authors were not dualists like Craig and most contemporary theists.
I just say that to alert you to the fact that it's not unheard of that there are Christians who don't believe in the existence of an immaterial soul in addition to the body.
Which shouldn't be surprising given that this concept is alien to the authors of the Old Testament.
Now, I believe in such a thing primarily because that's what's taught in the Bible.
It looks very much like the exact opposite is the case. What's taught in the Bible is that life and the soul are just breath, not some immaterial entity.
And I think that, as I said before, I have good reasons to think that what Jesus said and did were correct.
What Jesus said is not that we have an immaterial soul that goes to an afterlife when we die.
Our view that you die and your soul goes to heaven or hell is not found anywhere in the Old Testament, and it's not what Jesus preached. I have to show that in my book. I lay it out and explain why it's absolutely not the case that Jesus believed you died and your soul went to heaven or hell. Jesus had a completely different understanding that people today don't have.
Jesus was an apocalypticist, meaning that he believed that when you die, you effectively lie unconscious until Judgment Day, when everyone is judged and those who are good get raised bodily from the dead and live on forever. And those who are judged to be bad just stay dead. They don't go to hell, they just stay unconscious forever. Jesus had no concept of a soul that exists forever in an immaterial afterlife.
And that, therefore, when the Bible teaches that we have a soul in addition to the body, that it's right, unless there's some sort of overwhelming defeater of that.
If what Bart Ehrman is saying is true, it looks like the defeater of Craig's interpretation of the Bible is the Bible itself.
But there are also good philosophical arguments, too, I think, for thinking that there are immaterial souls in addition to the body. Things like freedom of the will.
If by freedom of the will, Craig means that our choices are not determined by prior causes, and if that actually is the case, which is debatable, there is no reason it can't be a material phenomenon. At the quantum level, certainly, there are physical events which are not entirely determined by prior events. The occurrence of non-determined events need not be an immaterial phenomenon. Matter can carry out such events as well.
Mental causation.
If the mind is simply what the brain does, then mental causation is also a physical phenomenon, which does not need anything immaterial to be involved.
And intentionality, the ability to think about something, are all incompatible with us being purely physical objects.
I don't understand how thoughts being about things is different from any other form of information storage. An example of natural physical information storage, which I often use, is a rock falling into some mud. When a rock falls into some mud and leaves an indentation, the shape of that indentation contains information about the shape of the surface of the rock that created that indentation. How is this aboutness different from our thoughts being about something? If we think about a rock, our brains replay information that they have physically collected from experiences about rocks. That information is stored among our neurons just as physically as mud stores information about the shape of a rock that created an indentation in it.
And so I think those kinds of phenomena give good grounds for thinking that we ourselves are minds, immaterial minds, who are coordinated with a brain and nervous system.
How does that work exactly? All of the functions we see in the brain are mediated via the electromagnetic force. Are souls subject to physical forces? Is there some other force at play? If there is, why haven't we detected it? How would a non-physical mind have any effect on a physical brain? Why, if the soul does coordinate with the brain, can it apparently not coordinate with any other matter? If the mind can coordinate with the neurons in my brain, then why is it that if my spinal cord is severed, I can't move my legs? If the soul can coordinate with brain neurons, why can't it bypass my spinal cord and coordinate directly with my leg neurons if my spinal cord is damaged? It seems like it's not just the case that my soul is unable to coordinate with anything outside of the brain, but is also unable to coordinate with anyone else's brain. If souls can affect neurons, why only the neurons in the brain, and why only in the neurons in one's own brain? And what would it even mean for something non-physical to have any kind of effect or carry out any kind of action? What would it mean for such a thing to even exist?
In such a way that these work together. The great Nobel Prize-winning neurologist, Sir John Eccles, described this view, or labeled this view, dualism interactionism. And he said, just as a piano player uses a piano to play music, so the soul uses the brain as an instrument to think. And if the instrument is damaged, then just as the musician can't make piano music if his piano is out of tune or defunct, in the same way, if the brain is damaged, then the soul is unable to think properly. So I like that analogy very much, that the brain is an instrument that the soul uses in order to think.
So when the soul goes to heaven and no longer has a brain at all, does that mean it can no longer think? Does nobody ever do any thinking in the afterlife? By this analogy, if the piano is broken, that will compromise the pianist's ability to play it, just as when the brain is damaged, it compromises the soul's ability to think. But to take this analogy one step further, if a piano is altogether destroyed, the pianist will apparently be able to play piano music just fine, right? Is that how it works? That would have to be the case if this is a fitting analogy and if we are to assume that people can still think in the afterlife. If your brain is altogether destroyed and the soul can still think in the afterlife, then why is it apparently not the case that the soul can think when the brain is alive but merely damaged? everyone who helps me out on Patreon. You're a big help. Thanks so much.